Hi everybody, this is Adam Jordan here. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, still a few people joining, so bear with us and we'll get underway in just a hot minute. All right, we're going to get started here. Again, my name is Adam Jordan. I lead our MISO and SPP teams here at Genscape. Today you'll also be hearing from Jarrett Verga, who studies SPP, and Josh Seneschal, who is our meteorologist taking care of our wind and demand forecasts. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking back at the winter that was, pricing, congestion, and weather. And then we'll look forward to the spring. We'll compare our expectations for this spring versus what we saw in spring of 15, and as well as some upcoming transmission outages and what's happening there. And then just a quick bit on new wind builds and their impact on congestion. So with that, Jarrett, let's take it away.
All right, so here we are looking at the pricing recap of the winter. You see this little chart here. It represents the DART spreads for both South and North Hub. The first takeaway is that the DART spreads are pretty tight. So on one hand, that's a nod to SPP and also somewhat of a lack of volatility. And as we dig in a little bit deeper, there is actually more of a story. So first, actually, I'm going to kind of skip at the last bullet point here. So if you look at the hub spread, the hub spread is greatest in January, and that corresponds with the Woodward constraint being the #1 constraint of that month. However, the DART spread is tighter for February and December, and that corresponds with South Haze taking first place for congestion during those months. And South Haze has less of an impact on the hubs. So that is the first takeaway. And then as we dig in a little bit deeper, we break it down on the next slide. Here, this is the DART spread broken down by, on the left, you have the peak demand hours, like the morning ramp, and then also, since it's winter, we have the shoulder pattern of demand. So the peak demand hours are on the left, and on the right we have the midday lull of demand. And this is actually quite interesting, and also not so much surprising. On the right we see positive DART spreads across the board for all 3 months, suggesting that the middle of the day is quiet in the real time. And then on the left we're seeing that December and January in particular show real-time strength over the peak demand hours. February is the exception, and February had positive DART spreads for all hours of the day.
All right, so a quick look at congestion here. We had 123 unique real-time constraints, total shadow price about $5 million. The top 10 constraints accounted for about 60%, almost 2/3 of that. Here you see a majority of these are wind-driven. You have your South Haze, your Woodward, but I think there's a few interesting ones here as well. You have Tuco to Lubbock, Woolforth to Terry County, Martin to Hutch. These are down in the SPS area, basically the Lubbock area. And we had seen a couple of SPP committee reports and kind of their congestion recaps that also supported what we've kind of seen all along, that there's basically a lack of supply when you get down into New Mexico that can help alleviate this congestion. You know, there were some long-term outages at the Mustang CCs down there. We would also typically see the constraint flip between Martin to Hutch or Tuco to Lubbock based on relative strength at Jones. So, you know, these are constraints that I think we'll continue to see. And then there's a couple of familiar faces, as Jared mentioned, your South Hayes. Again, taking the top spot, you know, Woodward falling to third place after being so strong for so much of the time that SPP has had the two-day market here. So really, you know, there's only one of these that's really over in the MISO area. I know our summer constraints, we've been looking at a lot of different market-to-market constraints. The sales to Texas East is right on the line there. There's a couple of long-term outages there, so something else we'll be looking at for the duration of March is the Ada to Minden line remains out through April 1st. So I don't think there's really too many surprises here. Not a lot of these are outage-driven either. So again, just the Gothenburg to Kozat at 10th place is one that I would really consider a transmission outage constraint, where a lot of these is more just a systemic issue of wind getting to where it needs to be, and a couple of constrained spots like that Lubbock area I mentioned.
Okay, so overall looking at the winter recap, it was a very warm winter. Just looking at the map on your top right, that is to look at temperature anomalies. As you can see, lots of red on the map, not much in the way of blue. December, February were warmest relative to normal, generally 4 to 7 degrees above normal. We saw a little variability in January. That's where we saw our peak load at 37 gigs. In comparison, last January we hit 41 gigs. So year over year we were definitely much warmer. Load was a little consistently weaker, and we had an over 10% drop in peak load year over year. So that's kind of the impact. Last winter we had an El Nino that was kind of in its infancy stages. This winter we had a record-breaking El Nino. So that year over year temperature and demand change really comes down to El Nino. All right, so taking a quick look at last spring before we get to our official spring forecast. Overall, we had your typical spring variability, although we did have a pretty notable cold snap in early March. That gave us our 38 gig demand peak, which is actually stronger than our winter peak this year. April turned pretty bearish. Temperatures were normal. Typically in April, temperatures are in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They're relatively comfortable. And that's why peak demand in April was 31.8 gigs. So we dropped from March into April, we dropped nearly 7 gigs in terms of peak load. And then heading into May, we had a cooler, wet month. And that kind of limited our ability to get some good cooling load going. And as a result, May had below normal demand. All right, so taking a look at our official spring outlook, we do favor above normal conditions mainly across the northern half, the northern 2/3 of the footprint, especially Kansas City northward. We do have near to slightly below normal conditions across far southern SPP. And overall precip, we do have near normal precip averaged through March, April, May for most of the footprint. Some of our top analog years consisted of years where El Nino weakened through the spring. These were 58, 83, and 98. And you know, based on some short-term model trends as well as some of our climate models, we definitely have additionally warmer risks to our outlook. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in the next slide. And so this is a monthly breakdown, March, April, May from left to right. March and May definitely are 2 months where we have the most significant warm risks. Just looking at next week, or this weekend into next week, we're going to be in the 60s and 70s, which is well above normal, 10 to 20 degrees above normal into next week. So if anything, there's a good chance we'll have above normal conditions in March. April, we do have slightly greater coverage of below normal conditions, maybe south of Kansas City, also some slight warm risks to that. And then you'll notice in May, this is kind of our one interesting month. We do have pretty widespread warm anomalies. Some of our climate models, the Canadian and European model, do favor well above normal temperatures. So I do think that we could actually see, you know, despite a relatively bearish move into spring, I think we might see a pretty bullish finish in May. So in terms of historical weather trends, energy demand usually decreases from March into April, and that's as temperatures get warmer and we see heating load begin to vanish. And then demand usually increases by May. As temperatures get warmer, we get into the 70s, 80s, even occasionally the 90s by late May, and that's where we start to see our cooling load develop. So overall, a lack of significant cold should prevent any notable March heating load. And then we do have those bullish demand risks really focused in on May. And the image on your right looks at monthly demand peaks. And as you can see, our forecast for March is well below average, and it's also well below last year. And that's due to the fact that we're going to have an extremely mild start to March, and we're not going to have any, we're just not going to have any significant heating load. That's high confidence. April, we have our demand forecast relatively close to normal, and then May, we do have above normal load. The green is average, the green bar, blue is last year, yellow is our forecast, and as you can see, we are above both the average 2015 for May. So in contrast to last spring, where we had our demand peak hit 38 gigs in March, this time around, we like 38 gigs occurring in May. And then closing out the weather portion of this PowerPoint with wind. Spring usually brings the strongest seasonal wind to the footprint. Already this winter, we saw the wind record broken almost once a week. Of course, we have had a lot of wind farms. Recently, we have more wind farm additions slated through the end of the year. But we're going to continue to see plenty of wind through spring. Now, April is usually our strongest wind month. But really all 3 months, March, April, May, we'll have that typical diurnal wind curve, wind peaks during the overnight and then drops during the midday. And some of our top analog years are slightly bearish for overall wind generation, but the fact that we have more wind farms coming online, I think is going to kind of nullify this bearish look. And our current wind record, I believe, is 10.3 gigs. We set that on the 18th, and I think there's a very good chance we break that several more times in the spring. Also a good chance, I think we get close to 11 gigs at some point in April or May. So we got plenty of wind slated due to the fact that demand is usually weak in March and April. Wind will probably be one of the main drivers of volatility. And then once we get into May, we get some heat going. I think demand will probably be a little bigger part of the equation.
All right, so thanks for that, Josh. Now just a quick look back at what we were talking about last spring in terms of congestion. It was still very much Osage and Woodward. Again, these are falling. Osage, we've seen those SPS risks shift further south towards Lubbock. And now we'll be talking a lot more about Tuco and even some newly created flow gates around Plant X, as there's quite a bit of line work coming in and out there. Tubular to Dobbins is an interesting one. This is one that is a MISO constraint, and there is very little, in our view, that can be done to relieve this congestion. There's actually an SPP component to it. The Harrison County gas plant that actually Genscape monitors feeds into a line, Crockett to Grimes. When that power gets down to Grimes and Frontier, which is a MISO and ERCOT switchable unit, when they are running in MISO, which they tend to do based on what we see in the ERCOT day-ahead commitments, when we see that combination and some good load in that west of the, the WOTAB area, East Texas essentially, we see this tubular to Dobbins line bind. So it has a fairly limited impact in SPP. It does have a nodal impact. It could be of interest to the anybody who can maybe take a virtual make a virtual play there. But the rest of these, Fairport, Osborne, Milan to Clearwater, a couple of these others, they're either wind driven or we'll need some specific transmission outages to see them again. So, have a lot of name recognition on this list. Some of these we'll be talking about again. But for the most part, where are they now? They're still here, just varying levels of risk. So
next up, looking at the spring schedule for outages, there are many. And here there's a stretch of 3 slides, which you can look at in more detail after the presentation. But just to highlight a few things here, this SPS congestion that Adam was just talking about is going to be exacerbated by a few outages around Lubbock East, and that's going to heighten some Carlisle to Dowd and Woolforth to Terry congestion, which we've been seeing lately. There are several outages around Hoskins, which make sub 1226 to Tacoma interesting, particularly when Walter Scott runs very strong and George Neal is weak. This risk is also sensitive to demand in MISO North and even parts of the Dakotas, but as we enter the spring, obviously demand is going to be less of a factor here, so that somewhat mitigates risk. A highlight on Blue Springs to Blue Creek congestion. It's the last one on the slide as we see some outages around Wayside, and Blue Springs congestion has been a hot topic for the last month or two. Next, starting next week, we have outages around Canyon East, and this is the next segment of the line of Osage to Canyon East, so this is going to really shift congestion from Osage to Deaf Smith, whether it's Bushland to Deaf Smith or the Deaf Smith transformer, and maybe a little bit of Harrington to Potter. Harrington to Potter congestion. That was our local language coming through there. Sorry about that.
Keep it real.
Slight risk for every ball.
That's right. So next, so just to highlight one other thing here, keep an eye around Rapid City. There are a few long-term outages there. These actually just came onto the schedule recently, and that puts some pressure on the Underwood transformer. Okay, finally, leaving on a high note here, there are a ton of outages around Mingo, and the most notable will be Mingo to Satab. These are all scheduled in May, at least the Mingo to Satab outage is scheduled in May. There are some other smaller ones in the neighborhood, 115 kV line outages that are occurring in March and April. But the takeaway here is that if Mingo to Satab comes out, we're going to see more flows move from Gentleman to Sweetwater and coming down from Axtell to Post Rock. So this pattern of flows is going to increase risk on the Knoll to Red Line constraint and actually decrease risk at South Hays. So this is probably the biggest takeaway of outages for the spring will be work around Mingo, making South Hays to Hays less of a risk and Knoll to Red Line more of a risk.
Okay, I'm going to touch on pricing a little bit here. And also, I think fuel mix is particularly interesting. In recent months, we can see that coal as percent of the fuel mix has dropped about 10% from a similar period about a year ago, or even 2 years ago when the integrated market first got going. Gas has made up a part of that. You know, we see falling gas prices, certainly making it more competitive with coal, in particular aging coal units. Also, hydro had a big jump when the integrated system joined. It moved to about 5% of supply as of 10/1, which is when the integrated system joined. But something that we've been talking a lot about recently is wind penetration. Basically, how much supply is coming from wind generation. And the chart on the lower right is probably not too big of a surprise at all. This is the last 6 months. If we kind of bucket or have these ranges of how much wind is supplying, you can see a pretty clear relationship between how much wind there is and what it does to the price. Now, the last few days, the last few weeks, we've seen some incredibly bearish pricing, not only for North Hub, but also in that marginal energy cost. We don't have a huge sample size in this 40 to 45% penetration range, but it's pretty clear that it is having a very bearish impact on price. I think something else that's interesting, when I first wanted to look at this, I wanted to look at kind of implied heat rate. We had talked about some of that in our last outlook to see, did the integrated system actually make prices cheaper? And the short answer was, in a sense, no. It was really falling gas prices that did that. And as we kind of continue that analysis forward, lo and behold, the implied heat rate is holding pretty steady. I did lay the implied heat rate over this wind penetration chart, and it literally was 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 1 as you go through these buckets. We skip 2, but it doesn't get more linear and pretty than that. So wind is something that, again, as we're heading into this kind of bearish demand, bullish wind season, something that you'll be hearing a lot more about from us. Of course, wind is kind of tough to predict as far out as April, but we have a lot of wind coming our way. So long story short, while we won't put a number on it, we do expect kind of a bearish environment to continue in terms of price. So we'll look to congestion to shake things up and either provide some upside or actually exacerbate some of these nasty conditions in certain parts of the footprint. So I'm going to jump to, sorry, we got out of order here. So, if you subscribe to our monthly report, you will have seen some commentary around new wind builds and impact on congestion. And now that that's kind of been out there for a while, I kind of wanted to revisit this with a wider audience. There are certain areas where, frankly, it looks like wind builds are outpacing transmission builds. There's 2 areas I think that we're all fairly familiar with. One of them is central Kansas, and that's South Hays. That used to be a very common constraint. And if we look at when it bound or when it was binding, it kind of took a break last year. Really once the Y plan and those 345 kV lines energized in western Kansas. It popped up a few times over the summer when there were specific transmission outages and some very specific scenarios. And then all of a sudden, it vanished, and it showed up in October, and it started showing up with some regularity. Now, if you look through the pricing files, they confirm what we suspected to be true. There's new wind farms that are both on the source and sink side of these constraints. South Hays to Hays, I don't have a table for because there's nothing that was built on the sink side of this. There were new wind builds on the source side, and they are contributing there. That looks like an area where we've seen that incremental wind build really push that South Hays constraint back over the edge. Another area is the Woodward to FPL switch. So what we have here are a table of new wind farms and their estimated shift factor and their size. So on the source side, we do see that Balco wind at the bottom there, fairly high shift factor and the largest of the lot. So we have there's a net increase on the source side of Woodward, but we do see some new builds on the sink side. So there is some relief as well, and this makes the location of the wind as critical as the strength in a sense. If we see wind shift to the east or to the south, we'll catch a little more of that Oklahoma City east and south. There's been a lot of new builds there. And that's an area that we can actually see that push back on Woodward and get a little bit of relief there. WAPA load, interestingly, has a non-zero shift factor. It's pretty weak, 0.5%, but when it's on some of those cold, bitter days, having some load up there, I know there weren't too many cold, bitter days, but having some load up there actually provides a little bit of relief as well. So this is something that we will watch really continue to unfold here. I think it was it the wind integration study that SPP recently published? As much as 4 gigs of new wind is expected to come online this year. I think that's pretty optimistic going through that list, but it certainly paints a picture. So, there are some more 345 kV lines in the works. Some of the big ones that provide prolonged relief for constraints like Woodward are still several years out. They're going to double up the circuit on that contingency, but that's, I think, 2020 when they're going to double that circuit. There's some little things along the way that will help, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on. This new Mathewson substation we've wrapped on a lot. It's all still single circuit stuff, so we do see some relief there. Northwest transformer, probably not going to be an issue. We will see congestion move. We see Elk City transformer. Right now we're in the throes of Woodring. Again, that's driven by an outage, but we're looking at some new names, and that's kind of what we expect to continue here. Every time they squash one constraint, another one pops up. It's the old whack-a-mole. So that about wraps up our prepared thoughts for today. I see we do have some questions here that have been coming in. So please pass any more along that you have. We're going to go on mute just for a second, and we will be back with those questions. All right, so thanks for giving us a moment to catch our breaths and deal with some of these interesting questions. One question here was comments on 2016 spring outage, given that our last outage season was very light. In general, we do expect to see more congestion for that reason. I suspect that outage season was particularly light in the fall, in part due to the integrated system joining. I think points north did delay, and even within the integrated system, they were told they couldn't for a certain period. It wasn't a very long period, but that's a good observation. So we do expect that to have more congestion coming along with it. And hopefully we got into that a little bit more when Jarrett went through the specifics. You mentioned a shift away from Osage to Canyon. Why do we think it isn't strong anymore? So there have been some, what is it, Excel there? They've been doing quite a bit of line work. A lot of it is lower voltage, but there has been some smaller lines added there that we suspect is part of it. There have been some builds of generation to the south there. Expect that they are fairly low capacity factor additions, but they could provide relief for some of that. So it's getting a name of those outages we can kind of follow. Or I'm sorry, the new transmission lines. They don't have them at my fingertips. Another good question here. Can you give a take on additional wind added to West MISO in Iowa for later this year into next year? It's a really good question, and it touches on something else that we are seeing a lot of. The wind in western Iowa will do a couple of things. One of them is it will increase the pressure on the lines flowing into Kansas City. We haven't seen a lot of that congestion lately. Overall, we've seen a pretty good thermal stack in Kansas City. Recently, we have seen a little bit of Cooper South, but I think that's one example of a constraint that we could see more of, particularly when we see relatively strong wind in those areas relative to kind of the core SPP area. North and south wind are becoming more of a story versus just Panhandle versus eastern Kansas. So that will be something that we're keeping an eye on. That's my gut reaction there, is that puts pressure there. There is a line that's being built. It's Nebraska City to Sibley, I believe, and I think it's going to energize in 2017. Don't quote me on that, but that is something that will offset some of that, that'll help deliver that wind to where it needs to be and provide some relief there. So that will be a big change there. When that energizes in general, you'll hear a lot less about Omaha, Kansas City corridor congestion. Just on, fundamentally, we'll then start to look for that when there's outages in the area. Let's see. So I got a question here that I think Josh would be best to answer. So hydro and basically Missouri River. What feeds the Missouri River? And what is the expected impact on hydro production?
Yeah, so the source region of the Missouri River is area of the northern Rockies, mostly southern Montana and the northern Idaho region. I took a look at the snowpack earlier today, which was convenient, I guess. And the snow water equivalent compared to normal is about 80 to 100%. In that area. So despite some of the kind of spring-like warmth we've seen the last couple of weeks, which has melted a little bit of the snowpack there, we do have kind of a cooler and snowier look developing next week. As I mentioned, about 80 to 100% of normal snow water equivalent is already in place. So I think heading into spring, our snow melt and our overall hydro should be relatively close to normal. So certainly probably better than the last few years where we saw a very weak snowpack, and you can credit that partly to El Nino also. So.
Thanks, Josh. And we have one more here. Any nukes scheduled for outage? Currently on our radar, no. The next outage information I see that is public anyway. It's Fort Calhoun coming this fall. Wolf Creek gave us a scare there. We thought they were going to take their third march off in a row, but they just derated for about a day there. So we are expecting a good run from the nukes, at least based on public information that we have access to. So that does it here for us. If you do have any questions, you can see Jarrett and I's contact info there. If you got a weather question, we'll make sure we get it to Josh. Thanks for tuning in today. We'll send the slides out, and as always, if you do have any questions, just let us know, and we'll take care of you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.